Imagine a punishment so final, so terrifying, that it's still remembered centuries later. It wasn't hanging, it wasn't beheading, it was burial, alive. And to the people of the time, it was justice, a sentence where life itself became the weapon, where the earth above you didn't just cover, it tortured. The moment the first shovelful fell, hope disappeared. Breath became a struggle. Time stretched like a nightmare that never ended. And those who survived the hours below, they were never truly free. This is the story of those buried alive and the justice system that sanctioned it. In medieval towns, crimes were measured not just by law, but by fear. The greater the crime, the harsher the punishment. Among the most extreme, burial alive. It began with accusation, sometimes justified, sometimes fueled by envy or revenge. Once the verdict was passed, the condemned were treated not as criminals, but as instruments of a warning. Town criers announced the sentence. Neighbors gathered. The victim's final walk through the streets became a procession of dread. The accused would be escorted to a prepared pit, a hole dug deep into the earth, walls reinforced to prevent escape. Priests or judges often oversaw the ritual, blessing it as divine or rightful justice. The condemned might have been allowed last words or not. The ritual was both solemn and terrifying. The first shovels of dirt symbolized more than punishment. They symbolized control, fear, power. Once the first layer covered the body, the punishment began in earnest. Every breath became a struggle, every moment stretched endlessly. The living tomb transformed into a theater of despair. And those watching, they learned. They learned obedience. They learned fear. Because to the authorities, justice wasn't just punishment, it was performance. And this performance was as dark as it was unforgettable. Burial alive was not haphazard. It was carefully constructed. The pit was dug deep, wide enough for the condemned to stand or sit, but narrow enough to prevent escape. Sometimes wooden frames were used to keep the person upright. Sometimes a small opening was left for air, barely enough to survive. Officials ensured the punishment was both final and terrifying. The condemned were often forced to witness the earth being shoveled over their feet first. Every layer of soil pressed down, heavy and cold. The sounds of shovels striking wood or stone echoed in the tiny grave. Crowds gathered to watch. There was a ritualistic aspect to it, a moral lesson in public pain. Justice, in the eyes of the people, demanded that society see the punishment. For the condemned, time slowed. Minutes stretched into hours. Breathing became laborious. Panic set in as darkness closed in. Some tried to resist. Some screamed. Some whispered prayers or begged for mercy. But the earth didn't answer. The grave didn't care. Time stretched endlessly. Minutes became hours. The mind played cruel tricks. Shadows became threats. Every sound a signal of imminent death. Outside, onlookers watched quietly. Some felt horror. Some felt satisfaction. The punishment was as much about control as justice. It reminded people that the state, the rulers, the law could reach into even the most private of spaces. Even if a person survived, through mercy, error, or luck, they were never the same. They carried trauma deep within. They could never escape the memory of darkness, suffocation, and silence. Burial alive shattered both body and spirit. And in that terror, the law claimed its most terrifying victory. The act taught obedience, instilled fear, and demonstrated power in the most intimate, horrifying way possible. The threat of being buried alive rippled through towns and villages. People whispered warnings to children. Merchants cautioned travelers. Neighbors eyed one another carefully. The law had become a living shadow over every street, every home, every conversation. Crime was still committed, of course. Greed, anger, betrayal, human nature didn't disappear. But fear changed behavior. It reshaped society. Public graves became grim symbols, a pit dug not only for punishment, but for teaching, a statement carved into the memory of everyone who saw it. Families would bring offerings to appease local spirits or priests. Even those not guilty of crimes feared the long reach of justice. Courts themselves became more theatrical. Judges took care to enforce sentences publicly. Every detail mattered: the position of the condemned, the depth of the grave, the shoveling rhythm. The king, lord, or magistrate presiding over these punishments understood the power of spectacle. It was as much about psychology as law. Even the strongest citizens bent beneath the invisible weight of expectation. Life became a careful act of obedience. But the buried didn't vanish entirely from society's memory. Stories were passed down, whispered tales of those who screamed beneath the soil, of desperate eyes staring upward through tiny gaps, of the slow suffocation that seemed to stretch forever. The grave became a metaphor for authority, for fear, for mortality. And in this society, the living carried the dead with them. Every step, every word, every glance reminded them that justice could reach into the ground itself. It was a kingdom ruled not just by law, but by the dread of its most extreme punishment. When history looked back, it didn't see justice, it saw terror. The act of burying someone alive left marks that outlasted the soil. It haunted families, communities, and entire generations. The victims became symbols, not of crime, but of fear. Their silence screamed louder than any words ever could. Even after rulers changed and laws were reformed, the memory persisted. People remembered the pits, the ritual, the slow suffocation that defined the punishment. Survivors, if any remained, carried scars invisible to the eye. They avoided attention. They feared authority. They whispered stories to warn others. And the society that sanctioned such acts, it learned something terrifying. Control is more powerful when it invades the most personal spaces, when fear touches not just the mind, but the body itself. Burial alive was justice according to law, but its true impact was deeper. It shaped obedience. It shaped behavior. It shaped the way people lived in silence. Over time, historians debated its morality. Was it necessary? Was it cruelty? But for those who witnessed it firsthand, or whose ancestors did, the answer didn't matter. The fear remained. The memory remained. And perhaps that was the true purpose all along, to remind people that law could be absolute, that punishment could be personal, intimate, inescapable, and that even in life, death could feel closer than ever. The pit claimed more than bodies. It claimed control. It claimed obedience. It claimed the soul of a kingdom. And long after the earth was cleared, the shadow of being buried alive lingered, a silent testament to the terrifying extremes of justice.